Welcome to the second part of our lecture on missional hermeneutics. In the first part, we went over Jesus' essential call to realign, and then we talked about the big story of the scripture. And again, a lot more could be said about that big narrative, but that gives you the basic idea. In this second talk, I want to speak about the importance of reading scripture from a new location. And what I mean by that is really contemporary research on reading puts a high value on where the modern reader situates himself or herself in terms of their context, because we always read scripture from the context in which we live. So if you want to read scripture in ways that help lost people in your community to understand God, you can't simply sit in the four walls of your congregation or in your church office and ponder the word on their behalf. You actually have to locate yourself missionally in community with persons that you're trying to read the Bible for, so that you know how to communicate. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is what's the right location for deploying a missional hermeneutic in a way that speaks both to persons who are following Jesus as well as people who are not yet following Jesus. And to do this, I want to use the work of Michael Frost and Alan Hirsch, and really a seminal book that you ought to consider reading, called The Shaping of Things to Come. And they open their book up with a diagram, as you can see here, that has God, church, and world in circles that don't overlap. Now, in a couple minutes, I'm going to flip over to a more dynamic and really biblical view that shows them overlapping. But for a moment, let's just consider this first diagram that they set up. And this is what they call the Christendom model, where essentially God and the world are separate and they only come together within the church. And this is a key thing. And notice that in this context, the closer you get to the world, the more dangerous it is. The closer you get to God, the more safe and reassuring is. So the goal then was to get people out of the world and into the church so that they could encounter God. Now, a lot of our communities still function this way, that the church is a safe zone from the world. What I want you to begin to think about is the church isn't a safe zone as much as it is a missional outpost on the frontiers, out of which God's mission flows. Now, the church doesn't encompass all of what God's mission is, but what we have to say is God's mission has a church. But let's ponder this. A lot of churches are stuck in a context where God interacts with his people through worship, through prayer that take place within a church. Sometimes we even call our churches temples, as though those are the places where God is, where the idea is if you get into the world, that's a dangerous place where typical lay people only go into the world so they can do their work. Or we send out our evangelism team, or the pastor himself or herself goes out into the world to try to do the work of evangelism. But otherwise, we try to get people to come into the church. Again, this is an old Christendom model. Now, a better way to think about the relationship between God, the church, and the world is to use this more dynamic model. And notice this, we have God, church, and world all overlapping. And this lets us have some really interesting conversations. Again, this is from the work of Michael Frost and Alan Hirsch, page 158 of Shaping of Things to Come. And we want to talk, first of all, about the places where we have two of the circles overlapping. And then we'll come to talk about this sweet spot, which right here, this is the sweet spot where mission or where God, church, and world overlap. And we will look at that. Obviously, that's where we want to find ourselves. But let's look at these places where only two circles overlap. First, there's this place. Again, this is the new place because God and world didn't overlap in our previous diagram, but now they do. And this is an important fact. This area here is where we find the world religions, people trying to seek out God, but we also find, as Wesleyans, we find prevenient grace, and Reformed theologians would find common grace, the idea that there isn't a place in the world that will ever go where God's grace hasn't gone first. And that's really good news for us as we think about mission. Now, let's go over and talk about where God and church overlap. And this would be the same as this area here on our previous diagram. Where God and church overlap apart from the world, what we get is a non-missional spirituality. In other words, we value things that have nothing to do with mission. So a mature Christian maybe reads the Bible every year or spends most of their time in church. Like when I was growing up, every time the church doors were open, we were supposed to be there. Again, there's nothing wrong with this, but that can't be the only mark of spirituality. We're going to say mission is. And in this context, worship can be done in abstract because we don't have to worry about the world. We're just worshiping as Christians. So we use words that maybe only Christians understand, or words that we presume only Christians understand. And we preach to the choir. Our church expressions can be irrelevant. So oftentimes our church services, even the church themselves, look nothing like the neighborhoods that the churches are actually in. So they become essentially irrelevant. And theology ends up being done in the abstract. We don't answer the burning questions that people have. Instead, we give kind of classic theological abstractions that don't necessarily help people to live well in the present world. So that's where church and God overlap apart from the world. Now, it's also possible for church and the world to overlap apart from God. And this is where we would emphasize a technique-oriented faith. Like we say, if we could just get this certain program, our church would grow. Or if we just locate our church in the right place with the right zip code with lots of new people moving in, we'll have a successful church plant. Again, there's nothing wrong with trying to study best practices, but you can do that apart from the power of God. And a missional hermeneutic is going to remind us that we depend upon God's power to advance God's mission in the world. And again, when church and world overlap apart from God, we can substitute religiosity or even moralism and legalism for a dynamic moment-by-moment relationship with God. That's what conservative Christians tend to do when we cut ourselves off from mission and just focus on trying to reach the world apart from God. We talk about ethics and ways of life. And then on the liberal side, that's when would be accommodation, where you take traditional Christian words, but you suck all the meaning out of them, and you essentially allow people to believe whatever the current culture believes, and you accommodate to that within the church. Now, obviously, we want to reject both of these areas and look at what does it look like to where God, church, and world all interact, and that's the sweet spot. A missional hermeneutic is calling us to this spot here. And notice what we have in this case. We have an incarnational engagement. Again, the church and God, we're going into the world and living as God's hands, feet, and mouthpieces and incarnating the gospel in the cultures that we're trying to reach. Just like Jesus, when he called his disciples on mission, he said, I'll make you fish for people. Who is he talking to? He's talking to fishermen, so he used the vocabulary of their own professions to help them understand what it means to be on mission. And discipleship then is defined in terms of growing to be persons who can reach others with the gospel. Spirituality is a spirituality that's in becoming like Jesus, not just doing certain kinds of spiritual practices for their own, but it's being like Jesus. And how did Jesus practice his spirituality? By going into the world. And instead of being a church at the center, we're now a church on the frontiers. And so this is the place we do our reading from. And when we locate ourselves in those places where God, church, and the world come together, the cross is here. We're the first ones to go to the spot, and we invite the church then to realign with God's mission and go into the world to make disciples, while simultaneously calling persons who are still in the world to come in and encounter God at the foot of the cross. So that's the location. So you want to ask yourself, where do you read Scripture from? What is your practices for reading the Scripture? And remember your audience, because in a missional hermeneutic, we're trying to hear the Bible for persons who already know the story, who know Jesus, and we're calling those persons to realign so that we can be relevant in God's missional people today, while simultaneously reading the Bible in such a way and speaking the good news of the gospel to people who don't yet follow Jesus, so they'll be hearing our words as an invitation to align with what God's doing. So we want to remember that dual audience at all time. And what do these two groups have in common? They're all humans. So when we start talking about mission, community, and holiness, what we're really doing is we're calling all people to come and experience what it really means to be a human being, a person, and become part of God's missional community that reflects God's character to the world, in the world, and for the world. We'll say some more about this in part 3.